Welcome to another Thursday night Bible study, brought to you as a ministry of SIGBC.
Contemplating part 2 of our study on the subject of our debt is to love, and based upon the admonition that we should have no debt except for the continuing debt to love one another. Love is a subject that is frequently talked about, often misunderstood, and sometimes even among Christian circles applied incorrectly, conceptually. Some of the things that even pastors are occasionally heard saying is that love is an action and not a feeling. And so whether we like someone or not, we need to be willing to act on their behalf. And the romantic aspect of love is that love is all about the feeling. And if love is all that matters in marriage, then that's a very wobbly foundation for a marriage, because if love is a feeling and love is all that matters in a marriage, then when the love is somehow no longer experienced or felt, then the problem becomes there's no basis for the relationship anymore. And so we need to understand it's a very practical as well as pragmatic issue to contemplate. And Jesus focused more on love than probably any other single subject. And genuineness, heartfelt love, and throughout the Old and New Testament, the emphasis has been on loving our neighbor as ourselves, loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus said, "A new command I give you, that you love one another." So last week we contemplated the fact that we are to have no debts except for the debt, no debts outstanding, that is. It doesn't mean we can't borrow money, but it says we're to have no debts outstanding that is left unpaid. In other words, every debt is to be completely paid off, except for the debt to love one another. And we looked at the issue of debt both from the perspective of the person who loans money and the person who borrows money. And we saw the three principles of, if we have it in our means to be able to help someone by loaning them some money, the Bible says we should do so. And if we loan somebody money, it should be with a heart that says that we don't expect it back. And the third thing we considered was, if someone borrows money as a Christian, you have an obligation to pay back that money regardless of whether or not the person expects it back. The obligation is to repay that. And so let no debt remain outstanding. Don't leave debt hanging. Just pay off all of your debts, Paul says, except the debt to love one another in Romans chapter 13, verse 8 through 10. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commands there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. If we love God as we should and love our neighbor as we should, then obeying God's commands and doing what is right is not that difficult. Last week, we contemplated the idea that God desires that we repay all of our debts completely but one, and that is our debt to love others. As we just read, let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt, the one that never goes away, to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. In Psalm chapter 37, verse 21, we read, "The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously." The idea is that we are supposed to be willing to loan, willing to help, willing to give for those who are in need. The second thing we saw was God desires that we obey his moral will as an expression of our love for our neighbor. So God has commands that are related to our relationship with him, and God has commands that are related to our relationship with one another. And so God desires that we obey his moral will as an expression of our love for our neighbors. And so he gives some examples, and he says, the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And whatever other commands there are relating man to man, they can all be summed up in this one command, which is love your neighbor as yourself. So he lists 4 commands: don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet. And then he says every other command as well is based upon loving others as we love ourselves. So obviously adultery is a big deal, murder is a big deal, stealing is a big deal, and coveting doesn't seem like that big of a deal because it's something that we feel in the heart but we don't necessarily act on. And coveting is the feeling that results in an action, technically opposite of love. So what is wrong with coveting, and how is it different from envy or jealousy? Well, with envy and jealousy there is good and bad aspects of envy and jealousy, but covetousness it's just bad. The idea of covetousness is translated in the New Testament, and also, by the way, the word covetous can also be translated as lust or self-centered thinking, which is the opposite of what love is supposed to be. So the Greek word that is used here is the word epithumia. And epithumia means to set the heart upon, to long for that which belongs to another, or to lust after. And so we saw in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, you shall not covet, epithumia. Or in the Hebrew, in this case, which is what Jesus is quoting in the Greek, but in the Hebrew in this case, it is the word kalmad. And the word kalmad means to take delight in or to lust after. So both of them have pretty much identical meanings, whether it's in the Greek or in the Hebrew. But the word covet from the Hebrew here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servants, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. What is different from wanting something that your neighbor has is if you see your neighbor has a really nice car and you say, wow, I'm going to go buy one of those too, nothing wrong with it. But if you see your neighbor's house and you say, oh, I want that house, then if it's that nice of a house and you want to live in it, that means your neighbor has to move. And your neighbor has a beautiful wife, and you want that wife for yourself, that means your neighbor loses the wife. If your neighbor has a wonderful servant, or in the case of modern times, employee, and you say, oh, that's such a great employee, I want that employee, then the neighbor loses that. That's what's wrong with covetousness. It's actually the opposite of love. It is lust, because covetousness is self-centered and self-seeking and selfish, whereas love is others thinking and generous and compassionate and kind. The same word, by the way, is used in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 25 through 26, where Solomon warns about a prostitute. And he says, do not kalmad, covet, or do not lust in your hearts after her beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes. For a prostitute can be had for a loaf of bread, but another man's wife preys on your very life. So whether it's a prostitute or someone else's wife, don't lust after them. Don't covet them, because you're taking that which has been promised to someone else. Or even if they aren't married yet, will have been promised to someone else when they get married. Jesus taught instead that we are to love our neighbors by desiring good for our neighbors. But not just theoretically love in our hearts. That's important too, because love is always a feeling that always results in an action. So Jesus taught that instead of coveting, we are to love our neighbors by desiring good for our neighbors. Not just theoretical love, but genuinely loving in the heart and resulting in action. And then Jesus gave the illustration in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37 on, of course, that famous passage concerning the Good Samaritan, where the passage reads, Luke 10, 25 through 37, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do, action, to inherit, receive that which I'm entitled to, eternal life? Well, what is written in the law? Jesus replied. How do you read it? What is it that you think needs to be done to inherit eternal life? And he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. That's in the Old Testament as a command. And also in another passage, love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Because I know I just told you that I'm called to love my neighbor, but you're just talking about fellow Jews, right? Or you're just talking about those who live in my immediate vicinity, like the Japanese expression of Muko-sangen Ryodonari, the three houses across the street and both sides, the houses on either side of my house. Those are the people that are supposed to be the most important to you. Now, according to Jewish custom, fellow Jews were very, very important and nobody else mattered. But in the Old Testament, the command was don't misuse a foreigner and take care of one another. And remember, you used to be slaves in Egypt, so be nice to those who work for you. So he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, well, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest, and I wish we had time to go into this in detail, but it's really a fantastic illustration or parable that Jesus is giving concerning loving others. But he says, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, knowing that their thieves could still be there, and his supplies could be endangered as well. And his own life could be endangered as well. He came to where the man was. He saw him. He took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine on the wounds, put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, took care of him all night. Next day he took out 2 denarii, 2 days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have had. And now Jesus asks the question to the expert in the law that was actually there to test Jesus, to trap him. He said, which of these three, the priest, which is supposed to be the leader in religious worship, and the Levite, which is supposed to be serving the spiritual needs of every Israelite, or the Samaritan, who is a social outcast and rejected by Jews in society? Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the expert in the law, the guy who knew the Old Testament well enough to know that the most important commands were love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself, he replied, couldn't even say the Samaritan. He's like, the one who had mercy on him. And so Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So the idea is, our second observation, God desires that we obey his moral will as an expression of our love for our neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself, not just by feeling love for others, but acting in a way that is compassionate, kind, and generous. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Bible study. We'll continue this next week as we conclude our study on our debt to love, but then we're going to continue studying the subject of love in the days to come as well. So take care. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening. You can also join us in person or live on Facebook every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Japan time. This has been a ministry of Sakahogi International Grace Baptist Church.